Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. And with me today are Murray Dahm, the assistant editor, Mark DeSantis, Mark McCaffrey, and Lindsay Powell. Today we're discussing Ancient Warfare issue 105, which is all about generals and commanders. As I said in the editorial, it's kind of a strange theme because in a way it's a topic we discuss every single time, if only because that is the category of people that our sources, sort of the same social strata that our sources come from, or that they would like to be, or that they sometimes were. So we get their point of view all the time. So we tried to focus on how do you get the right person? How does he know what to do? And how is he appointed into his position? And we didn't get very many questions, but one question that we did get sent in, and the question was, to what degree is nepotism a factor in assigning commanders to their role? We briefly discussed that before we started, and we immediately got to the question, what do you mean by nepotism? Because you could say anyone in the family is automatically nepotism, whether they're capable or not, or if we're just thinking of somebody who's been assigned above his station, what he's capable of. It's Carlos Medina. Thank you, Carlos. It was a good one. I'm sure we can actually probably fill the whole episode with this if we get started. But who would like to start?
The interesting thing about nepotism is that idea of what is nepotism? Is a partisan of your side of politics, is that nepotistic because you've selected them to command your armies or be your subordinate commander? Like even Alexander the Great's armies, they're all his very close companions. That's what they're called. Is appointing them to the commands that they hold nepotism? They, for the most part, prove to be very capable. So it's very hard to argue that, yes, it's nepotism because none of them are awful. But, that's very tricky because you could argue, the only reason you got to be a commander was because you were a friend of Alexander's. There are some examples of commanders who fall out but continue to command. So in that case, you go, it goes beyond that. Thinking back through ancient Greek warfare, you get nepotism in the sense of, is Cimon the son of Miltiades? Is that nepotism, or is that two generations of the same family happening to have brilliant command? And there are examples in Roman history as well. So I think in each case you can basically look at, is that nepotism, or were they brilliant, or is it both?
I think implicit in the question is a deliberate choice of a family person. The Latin nepos is a descendant, a grandson, over somebody else. And of course, that puts the person making it at risk. They may choose the wrong person. They favor blood over intellect, if you want to put it that way. And I guess that's a whole interesting idea where people make some pretty bad choices and the result is written up in the history books. But as Jasper was suggesting, if you look at the Julio-Claudians, I mean, that whole dynasty effectively is nepotism made manifest on the battlefield. And I think that was done deliberately in order to further family relations of Augustus principally. He happened to be lucky that a lot of them are actually very good commanders in their own right. But then there's the wider context too, that he would actually construct and engineer that people who are not blood relatives could be married into the system, most famous of which would be Marcus Agrippa, but not limited to him. And that was then carried on by other people later in the dynasties. So what you find is that he constructs a family effectively around the connections and talents that he needs, and where those talents has to be as a military commander.
Maybe in terms of Augustus, though, that sort of is a bit more obvious that actually he is behind it. But if you talk about Alexander with his heteroi, or I'm sort of thinking in terms of some of the Roman and also Greek generals who you've got generation after generation, it doesn't necessarily, it's not the doing of the generals themselves to actually decide who is actually going to get into those positions. If you take Alexander and his heteroi, it's actually a structure of how the the Macedonian kingship is set up, that the king is supported by his heteroi. It's the structure of his government. It is the idea that in order to facilitate the different aristocratic elements in Philip and before him Perdiccas expand their control over the northern Macedon, then they are sort of bringing in the next generation of aristocrats to be educated in the court system, and then they're being lifted up into that position of heteroi. It's not necessarily Alexander saying, I want my mates along with me as such. He's actually in the system.
You could say when Philip II says to 18-year-old Alexander, oh, you're going to command my cavalry at Chaeronea, you're like, well, that's nepotism, but it's Alexander who will become Alexander the Great. And, when Pyrrhus of Epirus has his son Ptolemaeus command, it's like, it is nepotism, but the people who they give it to are very good commanders. So it's also our perception of, or who makes a good commander. And I'm jumping forward into Roman history. When we look at Domitian, the fact that Domitian is given command by his father, oh, that's nepotism and he's not very good. Oh, Trajan, oh no, he's a brilliant commander. Hang on, but it's exactly the same scenario. And so our modern perceptions of who the great commanders are often blurs that line, because Domitian was loved by the soldiers, had experience in the field, probably was as good a commander as Trajan was, and as Marcus Aurelius was, and that is that they all ruled through their subordinates and commanded through their subordinates. So that's the other thing, is that it doesn't really matter who you nepotistically put in command, especially in the Roman army and even in Alexander's army. You've got people in positions of command who the overall person doesn't matter.
I think what's interesting is you've chosen two names and they both end in the word N, because that's Janus, and that means adoption. So Trajanus was adopted by Nerva, and I forget who Diocletian was adopted by. But the point is the Roman system is very flexible in that way as to who you can call family. You can adopt people very easily, and that gives lots of options for people if you want to build dynasties or families where you can really rely on people to carry out the instructions you give them. What's very interesting, I think, is that in AD 14, when there's that moment where Augustus dies and Tiberius negotiates with the Senate to take over the Principate, the mutinies break out on the Rhine and Danube, and he sends Germanicus out and his own son Drusus. And the fact that he sends those two representatives, and by the way, they toe the line and stand up and represent him, is the reason why Tiberius can actually carry on, because his two sons actually follow their orders effectively to quell the mutiny and come back and get marching with the rest of it.
What we see, I think, is that we call it nepotism, but you have, there are various things that sort of are intermixed. As Mark said, in the Macedonian system, that is the setup. You have the king and his companions. Of course, the Roman society is based on a client system where you have the patron at the top and everybody else below him is due his loyalty to him and he is due loyalty to them. And that goes throughout society. So that's how society is built. So is that nepotism, or is that just how it's supposed to be? And in the case of the emperors, it's very obviously that what they're interested in, and I think that's what Augustus is trying to ensure, he is bringing them into his family so that he's ensured of their loyalty to him. Because the big, for Augustus, obviously, after having experienced 15 years of civil war, he is very interested in making sure that anybody he gives large commands to does not become tempted to go for the throne himself. So there's this endless interplay of, I need capable commanders and I need capable commanders who are very loyal to me. And as Murray said, in some of the more professional armies, which I think the Roman Imperial Army, you could certainly argue is, and maybe to a certain degree, the Macedonian army as well, it will run itself.
Well, you just have to look at Roman politics to demonstrate that element of loyalty in terms of the family name and the clan name. Most politicians in Rome are not going to have to run what we might think of as a standard political campaign to get elected. They are just going to have to go out there and brandish the history of their clan name, the history of their forebears. And that sort of extends not just in terms of Roman politics, but also out into the provinces as well, in terms of which provinces are going to be, have a particular affinity with certain clans. And that concept is not, isolated to the Romans. You've got, in terms of, it was mentioned before, in terms of the likes of Cimon and Miltiades, that they have particular impressions that they've made in terms of who they have alliances with, who they can actually work with in the greater, sphere of Hellas. And that is why they're being picked for military command, and why they're getting these military commands, because they can operate. They're seen to be useful because of their family connections in the wider field.
And in the Near East, I think it's interesting when you look at the Egyptian, Hittite, Assyrian armies, that the expectation is the son will command. That's what the son does. You have to go and prove yourself, go and command my armies, defend, conquer. So it's kind of a training ground, and we don't really know enough to go, is that nepotism, or is that, you will lead armies as the king. Therefore, as my heir, you need to lead armies so that you're experienced before you become king. Probably, therefore, there's an infrastructure below them that's stopping there being unmitigated disasters when the headstrong prince commands the army. Although, of course, there are examples of such headstrong princes causing unmitigated disasters.
Well, but that comes, it comes down to maybe how do you know whether somebody is going to be a good commander or not? Because there is not really a system in place to ensure that a prince is or is not going to be a horrible disaster. I think that goes throughout ancient history. I mean, you of all of us should know better than that. Is you have that literature that comes up to train people into how to be a commander, because once you get stuck in that spot, that's you on the spot. There's nothing that really prepares you for it other than seeing the example of others and reading about them.
Yeah, and you do get the examples of people who should have been good commanders who were not. A Cleon, for instance, is doing all the things that are meant to be done, and then what he decides is the best action is headstrong and foolish, and so he dies at Amphipolis. In the Sicilian expedition in the Peloponnesian War, the reasons for it, when it's voted for, you've got that demagoguery and greed and all of that stuff going on in Athens. And the more sane heads saying, don't do it, get voted down. And they, loyal to the state, then go on to command in the expedition they didn't agree with in the first place, which is amazing.
And in the instance of, for example, among the Romans, an emperor who didn't actually have a son to command an army, was he forced, therefore, to rely on someone who was there solely on merit? So, for example, Corbulo in the 1st century AD, or possibly among the Tetrarchy, who had various Roman generals who some picked their sons, but others picked someone that they were simply close to and relied upon on the basis of loyalty. I can see someone choosing someone on merit who was loyal, but if that person had a son, maybe they would choose the son too. So it might work both ways depending on who was available.
I'm reminded of Trajan Decius and his son Etruscus Hostilius, both dying at the same battle in 251. Where, the son is co-emperor, younger, commands the cavalry, he dies, then his son, the father, apparently throws himself into the battle, and they both die in a battle with the Goths, which is a black day for Rome indeed.
Yeah, and that's how you ruin everything, clearly. I'm just thinking of, cases with our art. It's almost... Sometimes it seems more problematic when there is a son or sons, like Septimius Severus. I mean, he's got 2 sons who are presumably with their father for pretty much his entire military career, which is extensive. Of course, then they get into a fight as soon as he dies, and Caracalla murders Geta. And then Caracalla goes on campaign, and that not a great success, and gets murdered while relieving himself. Maybe that's the thing, is that when the nepotism is too bad, then certainly at some point the army will take care of it.
But it seems to work in terms of if you go back into the Republic, where you have, I don't know, I don't know if there's as much evidence for it in terms of the Imperial, but in terms of the Republic, where you have sons and, those affiliated with the family being given their apprenticeship, so to speak, in the military field by actually joining the concilium of a family friend who is in command of a legion or an army, etc. The one that jumps to mind is, of course, this idea, and I love this, the concept of Pompeius Strabo having his war concilium before battle, and standing at the back of the room, you have got the likes of young son who is to be Pompeius Magnus. You've also got the likes of Cicero in there. You've got likes of Catiline, who is later to be on the other side of politics from those others. You've got a bunch of 5 or 6 named figures from the next half century, all standing in the back of the room as boys listening to the men talk about their battle plans, etc. That is anything to go by. There is the possibility of a sort of training regime there for, and it's it is working through those family connections, be them close family connections or the extended networks in Roman society, but it's there in some way, and it seems to come out with a certain number of positive success stories in the end.
I mean, one of the big criticisms of Commodus when he takes power, I think it's Dio Cassius, one of the first things criticized about his rule is that he dismisses all of Marcus Aurelius's concilium. And that's the first error he makes. So yeah, that idea of a concilium to curb the enthusiasms of nepotistic minds could certainly work in the empire.
Yeah, and you could also argue that that example of Pompeius Strabo shows how some people, you can get shown how to do it, but it also depends on innate talent, and some people pick it up and some don't. I don't think anybody would argue that Cicero was a great general.
He has his moments. He argues that his time in Cilicia is apparently very successful. He even considers writing some poetry about it, although he does consider that a lot. So, yeah.
True. It's an interesting problem. Murray, did you remember from your research into the Chinese examples what it was like on that side of ancient history?
Well, again, I think there's a real issue with the idea of the spring and autumn period, which we had in the battle in the issue, and the era of Sun Tzu. So Sun Tzu and Wei Zu are mercenary generals who appear in the following period, which is the Warring States period, where what you get is this idea of the best mercenary general candidate changing sides and being hired by all of these different kingdoms. Whereas in the earlier spring and autumn period, we're still in the idea that it's fathers and their sons who command. And in the battle, the son wants to charge and the father says, no, don't. And the son does it anyway, and wins a battle. So it's sort of headstrong turned into victory, as opposed to it could quite easily have been defeat. And in that sense, you've got the norm is that the emperors and kings commanded their armies and their sons were their subordinates. But then at the fall of that empire, you get the Warring States period, where it's almost as if there's a shortage of generals. There's no shortage of kingdoms, but they've sort of realized that I'm not the best commander, you are. You command my armies for me. And that's where you get a lot of this great generals of Chinese history in the Warring States period, from the 5th century BC down to the 2nd century BC, as a lot of them are mercenaries who are good at their trade. So in a way, it's not what we're talking about in family members in Greece and Rome.
So in short, we don't have too many real examples of nepotism by our standards. Is that a fair conclusion?
By our standards, the nepotism is that the person who is given the role proves unworthy of it. And so for instance, you could argue Commodus, Domitian, and probably a couple of others, but then the other, the hand of history has said, oh yes, Commodus, Caracalla, Domitian, they're terrible. It's like, well, were they? We're told they're terrible, but they're no less terrible than a Lucius Verus, who's also considered terrible. Because if you've got Marcus Aurelius, then his co-emperor brother has to be terrible. Poor Lucius Verus. Probably he was actually quite competent. And Marcus Aurelius says, well, you're the military one. You go and command the Parthian war. I want to be a philosopher, and so Lucius Verus earns a triumph in Parthia, and we're all told by the SHA and other historians he didn't deserve it. Marcus Aurelius did everything from Rome. It's like, no, he didn't. And then, and then they're going to go and fought the Marcomannic Wars, the two of them, and then Lucius Verus dies in 169, and poor old Marcus Aurelius is left to fight it commanded by himself, which he does through subordinates.
And to that point, it's interesting, isn't it, that what we call the five good emperors were all basically adoptees of all the people before them. They weren't related by blood. It was a family, I guess, based on competence. Didn't it start with basic? Okay, so Trajan adopted Hadrian, but I think Hadrian was the one who set up the.
Hadrian comes up with the plan.
Yes, exactly.
He comes up with the 3-generation. I'm going to plan it out and organize all the adoptions, all the marriages, and yeah.
And then Marcus Aurelius ruins it all by choosing his son, Commodus, whose reign ends with the year of the 6 emperors. 5 emperors. No, 6 emperors is 235. That's the death of 5 emperors. Yeah.
Would it be nepotism if you're sort of saying this is different because it's all adoption? Is it going to be viewed like that at the time in terms of contemporaries, or are they going to say it is nepotism?
I don't read that. I don't read that. If you read the Cassius Dios and other people, I don't. They just accept the system is the system, right? So by the time Cassius Dio is writing, he's already got another 50, 100 years of this whole setup, and comes to the conclusion this is the best system to make it work, right? We tried every other system, but this is the one that worked.
And I'm also just thinking in terms of perspectives. It's sort of the one that comes to mind is Decimus Mus and, his son coming through, and perhaps even the suggestion of a grandson, each of them doing the whole dedicatio in battle. And of course, they are seen as success because they are sacrificing themselves for the greater good of Rome. But, is that going to be seen as in a positive? It's positive because it is serving the purpose that their family is viewed as traditionally fulfilling.
This is what you do in this family. You sacrifice yourself.
And it's it's not exactly a negative nepotism that one is coming in after the other. I think it's, they need to be there not because necessarily they're good generals, but they're the lucky talisman.
And that also brings up the whole question of especially Roman history, where a handful of families, clans dominated most of their history, and they just kept on getting elected to consulships, being awarded commands of armies, and taking part. You brought up the example of Publius Decius Mus and various others. But is that nepotism if that's just who recurs throughout Roman history? You see the same names again and again. I think that nepotism, at least in our day, has that connotation that person who is nepotistically selected was selected because of the familial relationship and somehow was not worthy of the position and didn't perform in the position. And I would presume if they performed up to snuff, that they actually succeeded, and therefore no one cares about neposism.
It's still nepotism, but nobody is going to.
It's still nepotism, but no one really cares afterward. But using that to describe the Romans, for example, is difficult because they were selecting from a very limited pool of families, and Augustus naturally was, picking out people who were from his family who were loyal. Same thing happened among the Macedonians. Of course, you would want loyalty, and your kin would have been presumably the most loyal, Philip to Alexander, you would think. But even later on in the Roman imperial period, there's constant attempts to establish dynasties after the 2nd century, which don't really succeed very well. Constantine tries to sets up his own dynasty, but that splits apart. There's fighting among the various sons of Constantine. It all depends on how you consider someone to be a nepotistically selected. And of course, they would want to pick someone that they knew and was related. So
I think to go back, to take that theme and then to go back to Augustus, I think what you see also is what happens when things go wrong. So Augustus tries to adopt Marcellus, his nephew by his sister Octavia, and he dies presumably of typhus or something, and then goes through a family tree basically of adopting different people, including Caius and Lucas, and they're so young they have to be basically set up to be commanders. So they push the one under Tiberius and say, "Go to Germania, learn how to fight, do those things." And sadly, then Caius loses his life out in Parthia, or dealing with the Armenians or someone out there, and his brother Lucas dies, I think, going out to Spain on some military maneuvers. So they're taken away by disease or death through wounds. And then it ultimately comes down to the only person left is Tiberius, because the other guy, we call Agrippa Postumus, turns out to be something of a wastrel. So all his attempts, ironically, failed, except in the case of Tiberius, who I think actually was a good guy myself.
I was going to bring up what Mark just mentioned about the Decimus Mus family. Is of course also that the general, certainly in ancient history, is supposed to be in touch with the religious side and make sure that there's the blessing from above, if you want to put it that way. And you can see how in that case of that family, it's more than a talisman. Is sort of, you get a tradition of they dedicate themselves to a deity, then victory comes. So therefore, this is. Even, there's an extra argument to select them. It's not just that there's divine favor on that family, which is a part of the calculus that we would find strange now, but is very relevant in the ancient world.
You also get the anti-nepotism from Roman history, where the father who commands issues orders that the son disobeys, and that the father, loyal to the state, then sacrifices their son.
I'm going to add this example to Ancient Warfare podcast bingo, Murray.
Absolutely. If you're playing along, absolutely.
Yeah, for people who are guessing. I assume I know where you're going, but so please finish your...
Well, no, just that it's essentially anti-nepotism. So you've got the idea of that the state supersedes blood loyalty to your children because they disobeyed your orders.
Yeah, and therefore they have to be
made example
decapitated. Yeah, well, that's is it a bombshell? I don't know. It is a whole episode, I think. So I guess we did what we promised, and I guess we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much.